Great. Welcome everyone to another Thrive After Stroke support group. It is so nice to see a full house and lots of new faces. So I am so happy to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Lisa, who's a registered social worker. She's here to talk about a very popular subject, grieving, which we all know can come um, really kind of set in after you have a stroke when you all of a sudden have to grieve the loss of your past self sometimes. So Lisa's going to talk about grieving and the journey that is in a few different contexts. So I will pass the floor to her. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Hmm.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, as you all are well aware, a stroke is a life-altering medical event that involves usually numerous losses. Um, and I've just made a list of some of them here, but it's by no means exhaustive. And we can talk about that later. So, some of the losses that came to mind were health, physical abilities, um, oops, cognitive abilities of various kinds, self-image, self-confidence, self-worth, sense of safety and security, pastimes like hobbies and other things you might have enjoyed, various roles in your life, relationships. So the nature of relationships can change. For instance, if now you're dependent on a spouse or somebody else to help you out with some things, and also maybe you'll lose some people in your social network for various reasons. There's loss of a job and the income associated with that, um, loss of identity. I am a person who, fill in the blank, whatever, volunteered at my kid's school or whatever, things that maybe you can't do right now. Um, some people lose their faith, whether it's a religious faith or certain like core values and beliefs that get shaken. Um, Plans for the future, certainty about the future can kind of go down the tubes. And then there's this concept that I really like. It's called loss of our assumptive world. So our assumptions about our life can be kind of blown apart. So, for instance, people at my age don't have strokes. We're supposed to be healthy and fully functional. And, other things that you thought your life was going to be like you kind of had thought it was going to be predictable and involve certain roles and activities and abilities that you've taken for granted until now. Then there's some added complications, and things like what they call invisible losses, all those cognitive functions that other people can't instantly see, like, issues with concentration, processing, memory, energy. And then there's the other complication, well, there's many, but another one is that strokes later in life are not what they call a normative experience, right? It's not what you expect in your stage of life. I was looking up a statistic, and it's one I found was that about 10 to 15% of all strokes occur in adults between the ages of 18 and 50. So, yeah, very small percentage relatively. And so, oftentimes when you're reading about stroke or talking to people, even sometimes healthcare professionals, they may be accustomed to working with people who've, in their senior years who've had a stroke, and the issues and their challenges and needs might be quite different. Then the other thing that came to mind is that after a stroke, you're thrown into a strange new world of medicine and healthcare. There's unfamiliar language, lots of jargon, scientific terms, lots of concepts, treatments. There's just like a barrage of information coming at you. And it can be a huge learning curve and trying to understand it all and navigate the healthcare system. In the face of all those significant losses, it's natural to experience grief. Grief is actually an instinctive response. Um, And I'll stop there for a minute because I want to talk about some definitions to do with grief before I go any further. Now, the definition of grief itself is basically everything we think and feel inside after someone or something we're attached to goes away. It's often described as deep and intense, um, perhaps a profound feeling of anguish or heartache or misery. The word grief actually comes from a Latin word gravis that means heavy. Um, so, it implies a heavy emotional burden or a heavy heart. We sometimes see that, in obituaries, it's with heavy hearts that we announce, the passing of John Doe. So that heavy heart idea is kind of common uh, to do with grief. We mainly, though, hear about grief in relation to death and relationships. So, someone we love dies, we grieve. Similarly, though, if something we value is taken away from us, we grieve. If circumstances we were comfortable with or attached to change, we grieve. The stronger attachment to the person or thing, the stronger our grief usually is. That kind of makes sense, eh? Another grief-related word is mourning. Sometimes you hear grief and mourning used interchangeably, but they're actually different. So grief is what we think and feel inside ourselves, while mourning is the outward expression of our grief. So just a few examples of mourning are crying, talking about the loss, journaling, telling stories, praying, doing something creative, like maybe writing a song or a poem, participating in rituals, and there's lots of rituals, with death of somebody, oftentimes in terms of like funeral activities, and participating in support groups is another way of mourning. And mourning is how we gradually heal from grief by doing these active things. There's a well-known grief expert, and I can't recall which one because there's several of them that I follow closely, and they all have so many profound things to say. But he says grief demands expression and it demands a witness. So, in keeping with that perspective, if we were to bottle up all our grief-related feelings and thoughts inside, we would not and could not make a full, healthy recovery. Now, externalizing our grief comes naturally, more naturally to some of us than others. If it doesn't, we need to try to be intentional about that. And it may feel uncomfortable at first, putting it out there in any of the ways I mentioned to do with mourning. Another grief-related term is bereaved. You hear that sometimes, the bereaved son, the bereaved widow. So we usually use that when describing somebody who's been devastated by a loss and they're, in deep sorrow. And bereaved is one of those words we do mostly hear in the context of death of a person, but it certainly can apply to other significant losses. The word bereaved is interesting because it actually means, like from Old English, it means to be torn apart or deprived of something. So here's a description I read, and I'm quoting here to do with that feeling. The profound, violent, and painful feeling of having someone or something ripped away from your life, similar to a branch being torn from a tree during a storm. So that's just like one description I've seen some people write, and again, like it's a personal experience. Another one I've seen is like some people say is maybe it's like an amputation where a part of yourself is just suddenly gone. You've lost a piece of yourself. This is obviously all very unwelcome change, and it leads to a whole variety of reactions. So I think I'll start with feelings. Some of the feelings people may experience in grief, and again, I'm not probably telling you anything new, but I'm kind of going through it all, and we'll see afterwards what resonates with you the most. But anger, resentment, sadness, despair, hopelessness, helplessness, those are all pretty common. Sometimes there's an intense longing for the way things used to be. Uh, could be a feeling of overwhelm, like it's just all too much to process and deal with. Sometimes it's a feeling of just really being off balance. There can be a surrealness, like you're in a strange dream, and it just doesn't make sense. You could also feel nightmarish, like you're in a bad dream. Then there's also numbness. Some people sometimes don't feel anything, and even the usual things don't bring any enjoyment. Now, we might be tempted to push down our feelings because they can be pretty intense, and it's natural to want to avoid them sometimes. But I wanted to share this quote from Brene Brown. She's uh, you may or may not be familiar with her, but she's an American research professor. She's an author. She's got a lot of books out there. She's a podcaster, and she has a social work background, which I love, of course, being a social worker myself. Um, she says, we cannot selectively numb emotions. When we numb the painful emotions, we also numb the positive emotions. So, in other words, we can't pick and choose which feelings we're going to entertain. It's all or it's nothing. So that's kind of food for thought. Now, there are many thoughts associated with grief, and typically they're of a despairing kind of variety. So I'll give some examples here. I've made some notes here that I'm going through. So some of the examples thoughts would be, I don't know what to do. I can't do this. My life is over. What's the point? The future looks bleak. How can I possibly have a good life now? How can I think about a future? I can't see past this moment. How do I get through today? There can be a lot of confusion because, there's a whole jumble of feelings, and lots of ups and downs. And people can feel like they're on some sort of an emotional roller coaster. There can also be a sense of lacking direction, lacking meaning or purpose, kind of like a boat out on the sea that's lost its anchor and is just drifting around. So there's no question about it. Grief is a complex mix of thoughts and feelings. And I pulled together some nutshell descriptions of the experience of grief from a variety of sources. So I'll just read out some of them to you. Feeling gutted, empty, or dead inside. Your world, your sense of safety, and your routines are broken. It's an often overwhelming and lonely journey that leaves the survivor's world shaken or completely uprooted. Grief is like an unwelcome intruder in our lives that refuses to leave. Grief is a protest against something I didn't want, I don't like, but I can't change. So, how do we understand grief? The most well-known framework out there for grief dates back to the 1960s to Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Many people might be familiar with her 5 stages of grief, also simply known as the stage theory. And those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist and a co-founder of the hospice palliative care movement. So these stages came about because she was interviewing terminally ill hospital patients and recording their emotional reactions to the news of their terminal prognosis. So she was looking for common threads in how they responded as they began to grieve the imminent loss of their life and their future. So that's where those stages originated. People, including healthcare professionals, jumped on those stages as a paradigm for grief and loss in general, because there hadn't been much research focusing on grief, and grief didn't get talked about much back then. Now, there's some problems with the stages, though. And one of them is that they were really intended just as a framework to help medical professionals and families understand the emotions of patients, who were terminally ill. Wasn't really meant to be any sort of a clear formula for grieving or a guidepost or anything like that. And Kubler-Ross focused, as I said, on the dying process, and that didn't apply so well to people grieving a death or some other profound loss who had to figure out how to live long-term with that loss. She did adapt the model later to those other kinds of situations, but yeah, it's they've often been misunderstood and misinterpreted. Now, though those 5 stages are always presented in the same order, but Kubler-Ross herself clarified later that people don't necessarily experience all of those 5 stages, and they don't, and if they do, they don't necessarily go through them in any sort of predictable or linear sequence, and there may be lots of back and forth between those different kinds of emotional experiences. So Kubler-Ross, did capture some key emotions of grief, no doubt about it. But we know now from newer research that grief and mourning don't follow a checklist or any particular clear formula. The process of grief is complicated, it's messy and unpredictable. It's more of a process than a progression, and it may never really fully end. So there are many grief models out there. The one I prefer is by a grief expert named Dr. Alan Wolfelt, Wolfelt, and he's got the Center for Loss and Life Transition based in Colorado. I've followed him for years and attended some of his workshops and things over the years. He talks about grief as a journey, not stages, but a journey. So he proposes a model for grief that's basically a long, often painful, and very personal journey that involves finding new meaning and developing a new self-identity. He has a whole bunch of intriguing principles, too many to get into here, but I'll just give you one example. One of his principles is that you must go backward before you can go forward in your grief. And what he means by that is that first you need to focus on what you've lost and feel all the painful feelings around that, get down in the weeds of that dark place of, going through all that before you can focus on the future. So he says, people often just want to get to the, okay, how do I get out of this state and move on? And he said, like, you need to go back and mourn the life that you had that you may not quite have anymore. And it's painful, and it's important that you do that. So there are a whole bunch of challenges in grief, but I've put down some of them here. For instance, learning to live with a reality that we don't like and we can't change. Searching for meaning in what might feel like a very unfamiliar, maybe even kind of hostile world. Finding a new normal because there's no going back to the way things were. Surviving the intense pain may seem daunting, and all we can really focus on at first literally getting through each day may be our one and only goal, and that seems hard enough. Another challenge is overcoming isolation, because it's easy to feel like nobody can understand what we're going through, and therefore they can't really help us, and it makes us feel very alone. Just kind of compounds our grief, I think. Another challenge is getting through to where we can see a light at the end of the tunnel. Not get to the end, but just see the light even. And sometimes, the way I like to put it is it requires sometimes just a blind faith, that things will get better. Or sometimes, I can't remember where I heard this term, sometimes we might need to borrow hope from other people. I love that term. If they have hope for us, we try and borrow it or let them hold the hope for us while we can't really see that light at the end of the tunnel, but we kind of trust that it's going to be there. Or um, another challenge is that grief, as I said, it's really isolating and it can be all-consuming at times. The thing is, we want to try to avoid letting our world shrink any more than it already has, and avoid getting like mired down in our grief to the point where we're completely overwhelmed and mentally and emotionally paralyzed. That's what we want to hopefully avoid. Now, there are many myths out there about grief, so I kind of had fun coming up with a bunch of them. It wasn't too hard for me, so I'll just share some of them. A big one is time heals all wounds. Actually, that's not true. It's what we do with the time that makes the difference. The passage of time itself has nothing to do with recovery. I mean, there might be some functions that come back, maybe, say, after a stroke. But in terms of the coping and the coming to terms, with the losses and the grief, just the sheer passage of time is not enough. And I think we've seen that probably in some people we know, like, maybe you can think of somebody, who's had some sort of significant loss years ago, and they're still bitter about it years later. So time itself didn't, help them achieve any sort of resolution. Another myth is that grief is a mental health problem. It signals something's wrong with us and needs treating or fixing. But as I said at the beginning, grief is actually a normal and natural response to loss, and it's pretty instinctive. And now I will say this, though, there is a certain depressive quality to grief, for sure. But most times people's grief response doesn't meet the criteria for clinical depression. That's more likely, maybe, possibly, to come down the line if they really get stuck in their grief, and it becomes super unhealthy, and they just, in a total rut. But most people, there can be certainly elements that seem like depression, but it's natural grieving. Another myth is there's a right way and a wrong way to grieve and mourn. In reality, we all grieve and mourn differently, depending on many factors. So there isn't sort of a blueprint for that. Another myth is that outward expressions of grief are a sign of weakness. There's an idea sometimes that people, for instance, who are doing a lot of crying need to just pull themselves together. But the reality is expressing our grief fully, especially externalizing it in some form of mourning, is actually what helps us process the grief. And little by little, that's how we recover from the loss. Another myth is that grief is a sign of a lack of faith. And we might even see that sometimes people, who are in faith communities, but, it's certainly natural, though, to question everything after a life-changing loss. Even if, for instance, we had a strong religious faith or other deeply held values and beliefs, everything's up for questioning sometimes when our world gets rocked by something major, like a medical event like a stroke. So next I want to talk about some realities of grief that aren't so well known. I'm just going to take a sip for a minute because I feel my mouth getting dry. Excuse me. Okay. One thing a lot of people don't realize, and they don't really like this, of course, is that grief takes a lot longer than we expect, and it's harder than ever, in the context of our North American culture that, it's very results oriented, efficiency driven, productivity focused. Um, we and people around us just don't expect grief to be as confusing or messy as it is, or to involve so much back and forth. You might feel like you took one step forward, now one or two steps back. It certainly isn't a nice experience, of course, and we'd love to get it over with as quickly as possible. But it doesn't work that way. In fact, there's a saying, I don't know who said it, it might be not attributed to anyone, but I love this one, and it's the only way through grief is through it. You can't go around it. There aren't any shortcuts. There's no fast forwarding option. You just gotta go through it, a bit at a time. Another thing is that grief is a very individual experience. I kind of alluded to that already. There's certainly some similarities and common themes, but no two people grieve exactly alike, even if their losses look very similar. Everyone grieves differently because of the unique combination of their personality, their life experiences, their current circumstances, and the nature and severity of their loss. And that means, as a support person, like me, for instance, I can only learn about your grief from you, not from having read a whole bunch of books or having talked to other people who've been through a similar type of loss to you. That certainly can help, but it's not enough in order for me to specifically know how to support you as an individual going through what's a deeply personal experience. Another thing, and this surprised me personally years ago, was that grief can manifest in a lot of physical symptoms in our body, like an impaired immune system. We might find ourselves getting, sick with colds and flus and the like more often than we normally would. Insomnia, fatigue, um, changes in appetite. I've heard some people talk about butterflies in the stomach that never seem to go away, but they're not there in a good way, like excitement, but in an anxious way. And uh, I experienced this firsthand, like I said, years ago when I lost a close friend very suddenly. It was just absolute shock. And I couldn't believe how many bodily symptoms I had. And I eventually went to the doctor because I thought for sure something was wrong. And this was early on in my learning about grief. So, like, I had this chest pain sometimes, like right here, and sometimes, like, in the solar plexus, and sometimes it was stomach pains. Just somebody had just punched me in the gut or punched me in the chest. And I had some headaches. And then sometimes it was just general aches and pains. And that all can be part of grief. Um, Another thing is that we may feel like we're going crazy because of the some of the things that we can experience, like brain fog, memory lapses, poor concentration, that roller coaster of emotions I talked about, or maybe numbness. We just really don't feel like ourselves. We feel really off kilter. That's a very unsettling feeling. Life seems very unpredictable, maybe even scary, maybe even pointless. And we may wonder and worry if something is seriously wrong with us and if we'll ever feel better. So some pretty heavy stuff. So then the question is, how do we mourn well? If mourning is how we heal, how do we mourn well? So there are many models out there for healing from grief. And some of them talk about healing, some of them call it recovery. I think it's a bit personal what some people, what resonates with some people better. Like I know some people like to say grief recovery, not healing, and there's other terms too. So I'll use healing and recovery interchangeably. Um, so I'll just share one of the most more basic models of grief, and it's called the three C's: choose, connect, and communicate. So choosing is making small decisions that give us back some sense of control, starting with self-care, like eating or showering, changing out of your PJs, or choosing to attend an event that where and otherwise you might just feel like staying home and maybe even staying in bed. Connect refers to reaching out to people you trust in your social network, friends or family or support groups, in order to avoid becoming isolated. And then communicate is about sharing your feelings and needs with others, honestly and openly, so they know where you're at, and hopefully they can then support you effectively. Now, here's the thing: you may need to be really specific about what you need when you're grieving, including what isn't helpful. People mean well, but they often just don't know what they don't know. And again, no two people grieve alike. So maybe they helped somebody else they knew who went through something even similar to what you're going through, but um, it's not helpful for you. So, like for instance, you might just need to cry or in the presence of a trusted friend, or rage against the unfairness of life. And um, and you can start maybe by saying, "Please just be here with me and listen. I don't need you to do anything else." Um, and that can be helpful because sitting with someone in profound grief can be really uncomfortable, especially if they're sobbing or saying extreme sounding things like "my life is over." That gets family and friends sometimes really worried, really scared, and they just sometimes don't know what to do with that. And there's that instinct, to want to try and make things better somehow. Now, you may have some people in your life who are good at simply being present with you in your grief. Um, while other people in your life might be more of the doer type who are good at helping with specific practical things. And that's okay. You know who those people are, or else you learn quickly, um, including learning who to reach out to when, depending on what you need at the time. Um, Now, I will say that we all have a kind of a natural coping style. Um, for instance, mine is information gathering. When something is going on, I like to learn as much as I can about it, to do research, whatever the case may be, if it's a medical condition, um, to understand what's going on and what to expect in the future. I like details, numbers, and statistics, but some people would find that overwhelming or just not helpful. Then there are people who tend to power through um, difficult times. They like to keep life as normal as possible. For instance, there's people who return to work very quickly after a major death, um, or they continue to work through cancer treatment. And other people might say, "Oh, I don't know how they can do that. That's the last thing I would feel like doing." So we're all different that way. Now, sometimes our natural coping style might be effective, but other times it might not, and we need to try a different approach. Um, so, for instance, when we're full health, maybe we can power through a lot of stuff, but not so much if now we have some health challenges. Okay, so next, I'd like to talk about what healing or recovery is and is not. So it's not about getting back to normal, because as we know that's not possible. Loss and grief changes forever. It's not necessarily about finding closure either. There often isn't a true endpoint to grief because in some ways we never really get over the loss. The way I like the framework I like for recovery is the idea of integrating the loss into our life. So we learn to live with it in a way that allows us to move forward in healthy ways with new meaning and purpose. Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who I mentioned earlier from the Center for Loss and Life Transitions, he refers to this process of reintegration as becoming reconciled with our grief. And in doing that, we achieve a new normal. Now, recovery doesn't mean some of the emotions of grief won't ever rear up again from time to time. After the more acute phase of grieving is over, they probably will come up now and then, but over time, the frequency of them and the intensity of the feelings tends to decrease. One way to think about the grief recovery process as we're working towards reintegration is that we are under reconstruction. That's a term Dr. Wolfelt uses, and I really like that. His online store of grief resources actually includes a lapel pin with that wording on it, under reconstruction. I just love that. It really resonates with me. So then we come to coping strategies. Because, well, we didn't have a choice about the thing that happened to us. We do have a choice about how we deal with it. There's lots of good insights and advice out there, lots and lots of it in terms of coping strategies. And I'm just going to share some of them here. And I'll just qualify it by saying, first of all, not all coping strategies work for everyone. And a certain amount of trial and error may be involved. Sometimes you have to try something several times to know if it's going to be helpful or not. Once might not be enough. So one of the key things is to feel all the feelings. And just, try not to avoid them, as painful as they are. Experience them all. There's a saying that I really like, you've got to feel it to heal it. I love that because, you've got to feel those emotions. If you're pushing them aside, you're not going to really be able to heal. Early on, though, you may be wallowing a lot, like in all those tough feelings, like you're stuck in mud, or some people describe it as being in a dark hole. They don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. They can't imagine how they'll survive this because some of the feelings may be so intense that it's scary. And we know that we'll survive the feelings as hard as they are. We can survive them. Another thing is acknowledging the losses, meaning all the ways our life has changed. Now, there's a form of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy that I've learned a lot about in recent years, and they have a concept known as radical acceptance. And basically, the idea is that as long as we deny things, we can't deal with them. And if we're fighting against things we can't change, it's not a good use of our energy. It's futile, and it's exhausting. So radical, at some point, the goal is to come to some sort of radical acceptance, maybe. So that doesn't mean we have to like what's happened to us. It doesn't mean we have to look for silver linings. It's more of a, it is what it is stance. This is what's happened. This is what's going on. And then another related concept in dialectical behavior therapy is the concept of dialectics, which basically means two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. For instance, I hate what's happened, life will never be the same, and life can still be good. It takes some training of our brain, though, to think like that, because our brains like simplicity. Like they like one thing or the other. This two seemingly opposite things can be true. It's hard to wrap our heads around sometimes. Another thing that's important is adaptation or being open to learning to do things differently or imperfectly. Sometimes also to prioritize whether we really need to be or can be doing them at all. Now, if we're perfectionistic by nature, it can be really hard when we suddenly can't do some things as well as we're used to. Or maybe we're impatient or high energy by nature and normally power through tasks really quickly. Now we can't, though. Maybe we're used to multitasking and now we can't. So there can be a lot of adapting that we have to do. And that again takes a lot of time and energy and forming new habits. Not easy. It's also important to be willing to accept help when needed. That can be really hard, more so for some of us than others. But especially, yeah, the younger you are, like you're not, it doesn't feel normal. It doesn't feel, it's weird to feel like you need help, even if it's just temporary. And the more independent a nature we have to begin with, the harder it can be. Help can be like informal help from family and friends. It can be help from healthcare professionals, mental health professionals. It can also be what they call adaptive aids, like a cane or a walker. Um, Using things like that may make us feel self-conscious. We may feel weak. We may feel vulnerable. So that can be that can be a difficult thing to come to terms with if those things are needed. Um, and I'll just feel the need to say here that asking for and accepting help are not a sign of weakness. They're actually a sign of wisdom, that you recognize your limitations and you seek help when you need to, instead of spinning your wheels or trying to tough it out to your own detriment. It's a different way of looking at being on the receiving end of help. Another key thing is don't go it alone. As I said, grief can be so isolating. Now this group here is a great space where you guys get each other in ways nobody else can who hasn't been through what you have. There's also different kinds of online message boards and such, all sorts of things out there on the internet and in person that can be helpful. There's also counseling available. Like I'm here in Hamilton, and we are most family doctors are part of a family health team, and they all have a whole team of different disciplines, including social work on staff and counseling. You can be referred for counseling through there. Some people have private health benefits that cover some type of counseling. Around here, like Green Shield and stuff, usually covers a social worker, sometimes a psychologist, but usually like a licensed registered social worker. And then there are also social workers attached to many inpatient and outpatient rehab programs. If spiritually you've been torn apart, so to speak, maybe your religious faith has been shaken by what you've experienced, and you have a past or present affiliation with the faith community, you might want to meet with one of the leaders there for support. Just another idea.
Lisa,
Yep.
we're just gonna jump in here. Is there any way we can sort of start to wrap up and
Yep.
invite some questions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll just talk about briefly that the stories we tell ourselves, and that's are really important. And again, it's an evolution, right? Because in the beginning of grief, we're just in survival mode. But at some point, it really helps if we can kind of do a bit of a mind shift to focusing more on what we can do rather than what we can't do. Like, or I can't do this yet, or I think I can do this if I'm just patient and trust in the process and get through the rehab, that kind of thing. So our thoughts and beliefs are really powerful, and they really can influence um, our feelings and our actions. Um, I'll just close with a couple of pieces of food for thought then. Um, One of the things and is that like grief does soften. It does kind of change and morph over time, but it tends to soften. Um, that allows us to kind of like move forward again and find meaning and joy in our lives. Um, so again, I just want to emphasize that what you're experiencing, in grief and mourning is not only normal, but as Dr. Wilfelt says, the mourning is how you heal. It's how you start to heal. And he says to mourn well is to clear the way for living well. So I like that. And last but not least, I have this parting thought. Um, we're all stronger than we think. I truly believe that based on my own personal experiences of loss and grief, and they've been many over time, and based on, the experiences of people in my life who've been through tough stuff and my work with patients in complex care settings. Um, we're so much stronger than we think. And there's this quote from an author named Glennon Doyle, and she says, "I see your pain and it's big. I also see your courage and it's bigger. You can do hard things. So give yourself the benefit of the doubt and give yourself credit for being an active survivor. Some might say a warrior survivor. I know you are one, or you wouldn't be here tonight." Thank you.